Hello, friends. Welcome back to the Metal Mama podcast. My name is Candace. You know me as the Metal Mama, and we are not going to pretend I nearly flubbed the first sentence of this episode. This is episode 2. We are talking about the correlation of fantasy and power metal, a little bit of where it started, a little bit of where it went. As usual, my dogs are jumping around in the background, being super annoying, and there's nothing I can ever do to stop them. So, we are going to begin by just taking a look at some of the new releases that I've seen these last couple of weeks kind of come across my desk, or whatever you want to say. I make it sound fancier by saying come across my desk, though, don't I? As usual, I do not give an in depth review on the new releases. I just kind of tell you a little bit about it, what I think, but really, it's up to you to decide if you liked it or not. New releases. So, first off, is Avantasia's new album, Here Be Dragons, is out and about. I gave it a solid listen, and it's interesting. And again, when I say interesting, I don't mean that's interesting, honey. It's not a condescending thing. When I say interesting, I mean it's interesting. It's a little less on the power symphonic ish side of things, which again, I am not debating where Avantasia fits. Couple of songs they really dig into this 80s sound, which I love it. Standout tracks for me on this album were Creep Show, The Moorlands at Twilight, The Witch, which I talked about last week, and Avalon. I really like this project, I suppose you could call it. I mean, it is a band, but yeah, it's more of a musical project. And I always think they do so great and have such a cool sound. I love how they're always experimenting with things. I enjoyed the album, but give it a listen. See what you think. Oh, and by the way, there is an official website. It is themetalmama.com, and you can always get all the show notes, links to tracks, and albums right there. Next up is Arium. Arium. I'm bad. I'm so sorry. I know I butchered the name. I apologize. These guys are a band out of Mexico. They have such a cool symphonic sound, and this new track gives some nice ethereal vocals to start with. They have a very fantasy feel with the instruments. I love their track because it is bilingual. You may not speak Spanish, but I do. I got a really good feel for the track, but I think, well, I don't think I know. Even if you don't speak Spanish, you're going to understand it because most of it actually is in English. And the reason why I'm not naming the track by this band is because I want to encourage everybody to go check out the metal that is available out of Latin America. It is so underrated. Now, as a Spanish speaker, I get a hold of it and I understand it. And I know that a lot of people are like, but I don't speak Spanish. Trust me, you're still going to like it. How many times do we listen to tracks out of name every Scandinavian and Nordic country here? They are not in a language that we understand. And we're like, yeah, I love this. Happens all the time. It's really no different. If you go and check out the power and symphonic metal out of South America, you're going to find some really great gems out of there, whether you understand the language or not. And frankly, if you live in the United States, I highly encourage you to learn Spanish because it is just going to be more commonly spoken here. You should at least have a good grasp of the language. This next band is a new band for me, and I want to thank my buddy Power Metal Ranger for turning me on to them. They are called Fortune Teller. They are a band out of the UK. Their track Savage Seas is what I heard, came out in later February. This was my first time hearing Fortune Teller, and oh man, they came out swinging. Oh, it's epic. I loved it. And we love female singers so much. Their lead singer is amazing. Got these wonderful soaring vocals that we love to hear in metal. I enjoyed every second of that track. I really hope you guys go check them out because they need the attention. Also, checked out a new track from Great Master. They are a band out of Italy. They came out with their track Shadow of Sundered Star. This is a very epic track, too. Got a little tiny bit of a Warhammer feel going on. At least I thought so. Definitely a battle theme. I am totally going to use this in D&D, and it is very appropriate for D&D. Now, Rhapsody of Fire, excuse me, I should probably say Rhapsody of Fire in parentheses, shouldn't I? They're also out of Italy, and I use them in D&D a lot too. So maybe this is an Italian power metal thing. Like Italian power metal is made for D&D. There we go. That is not true. Do not go around saying that I said that and meant it because I did not, but it's still funny. And while this is not a new track at all, this was a video that is brand new, and I saw it on a YouTube recommendation, I think. Video of Roy Khan singing Forever live. It was dated March 8th of this year, so 25, and I was like, "What?" Of course, I went and looked right away. I do not have context for why he was doing that or what was going on. The description was written in a language I don't understand, and I was too lazy to translate it. But I loved it. I loved hearing it. It was super cool. You can look on YouTube and find it. It's so cool to see that Roy Khan and his wonderful voice is sort of poking around again. I've seen him on a couple of tracks, like as a guest vocalist. Serenity's newest album, Roy Khan was the guest vocalist on their track, The Fall of Man. And that was so exciting. It is really nice to hear him around again because that man's voice is amazing. God, I love the fact that power and symphonic metal and that whole umbrella just has this almost endless line of these wonderful voices that just go across every spectrum. And it's so nice. I love that. I just do. I love it. We made it through the new releases, and we are going to jump right into the topic of the day. First off, I do have to apologize in advance because of the fact that I'm probably sure I don't sound up to par, and that is because I live in Atlanta, Georgia. There's a lot of pollen around this time of year. I have severe seasonal allergies, and they are definitely bothering me. So if I sound a little on the funky side, that's why. We are talking today and taking a dive into how power metal and fantasy kind of go together. And no, we're not going to answer once and for all how it happened because I don't think we actually know that answer. We know from individuals the answer for their own bands. And we're going way back before power metal had a name, before bands were being considered power metal. We're going back to Led Zeppelin in the late 60s with Ramble On. That was definitely a song that had some very fantasy feel, of course. Iron Maiden definitely had some fantasy inspired albums. And so before power metal was even a thing, you started seeing this little bit of fantasy thrown in as we continue to move further, and you have bands that are very much considered either power metal or pioneers of power metal, you started seeing even more fantasy thrown in. Manowar, of course, several of those. Halloween, several of those. Dio, hello. That's a no brainer. Blind Guardian, obviously the Tolkien thing going on. Rhapsody, who later Rhapsody of Fire. Not to mention, just about every album by them is some level of a story, including their latest one. And so in the past, we have seen fantasy thrown into metal, progressive metal, hard rock, power metal, symphonic metal, since this sound started to really evolve. It kind of stuck really hard in power metal. I mean, we make fun of each other as metalheads, and you know we all do it, and it's cool. We love this. A lot of times power metal's looked at as we're the D&D nerds, or I often joke that power metal is Tolkien, Vikings, and Dungeons and Dragons had a baby with an electric guitar. I'm not exactly wrong there. So we have all these fantasy things going on, and it's like, well, do we just have fun with it? Is that it? Or does it just work? What caused this? Where are we coming from with this? I think maybe taking a little bit more of an in-depth look of the definitions of power metal might help us understand a little more why this is a thing. Maybe. We want to take a look at kind of what defines the genre of power metal. For the most part, when you go across to very good sources, very good places, there's even at one point a person who is a cultural anthropologist that was sourced giving a definition of power metal. It is mostly defined by a faster, sometimes lighter sound, incorporates elements of speed metal, elements of symphonic metal. So we've got the overlap here. Typically defined as theatrical or dramatic, typically defined as having fantasy or mythical elements in it. So in other words, it really is D&D, Vikings, and Tolkien had a baby with an electric guitar and a couple of keyboards. Well, wait a minute. It's already defined with having fantasy or mythical elements into it? Well, typically. Not all the time. If you really think of it, though, when it comes to the elements of throwing mythology, fantasy, or both in there, because you do have a lot of people with the romanticism of Vikings thrown in. Brothers of Metal, we're looking at you and we love you. Brothers of Metal is an amazing band, but oh my gosh, did they go off with it? And I love how seriously they don't take it. That's the best part about it. Their videos are hilarious. If you have not watched their music videos, you really need to because they're freaking funny. But how many other bands can you think of that jump into the storytelling side of things? Either the band itself has its own story or their albums have their own story. Thinking of bands that tell a story, whether absolutely serious, fantastical, or silly, you've got Glory Hammer, Angus McSix. I went there. Oh, yeah, I went there. Victorious, which Holy Where Dinosaurs Fighting Evil Outer Space Ninjas is still a story. And those are just a couple of bands I'm naming off that the bands have a story. Then we move into the albums. We could go on for days about albums with stories. Blind Guardian has retold and told Tolkien's stories. They've told other fantasy stories. Rhapsody of Fire has told countless stories through their albums. Avantasia, yes, it counts. Just about every album tells a story. Or Nogan, half of their albums, if not all of their albums. Camelot, albums are very story driven. And while bands like Teresa's and Tyr are more on the folk battle metal side, they tell stories too. Sabaton, they tell stories. And yeah, the stories are true. They're not based in mythology. Sabaton is like the best history teacher ever. They tell a story. Sometimes you have people whose individual songs tell a story instead of the album. Unleash the Archers, Beast in Black, Angra. The list just continues. Storytelling is massive when it comes to power metal and also symphonic metal. If you look at the bands underneath this umbrella, a ton of them do take inspiration from fantasy, from mythology, from anime in some cases. I'm looking at Beast in Black on that one. And they're not the only ones who've done that. You've got people who take inspiration from video games. Looking at Windrose on that one. You've got people who are taking inspiration from every book they've ever read, which we don't even need to name those guys off. People taking inspiration from their D&D games or something about dinosaurs. I love the dinosaur theme with Victorious. It's just so silly and I love it. There's a connection here. There is a connection with fantasy in this genre. Is the connection simply escapism? Is that all it is? That would be an unfair sweeping generalization. Fantasy itself can get a bad reputation where people say, it's just escapism, guys. But then again, you could say that about any work of fiction. And that, again, would be a very unfair thing to just pigeonhole it into that alone. If it were pure escapism, then the influence fantasies had in general probably would not be there. Fantasy has influenced things from video games, board games. Authors have inspired other authors. Movies have been inspired by fantasy. Art and drawings have been inspired by fantasy works. And yes, music. And not just power metal either. You have a ton of different genres that pull from fantasy. Just seems that power metal tends to lend pretty well to fantasy. But to call it purely escapism and nothing more is a really unfair thing to say because you are ignoring the amount of creativity, the art in itself, because there is art in the written word, there is art in music, there is art in drawing. You're also ignoring the literature side of it, which I'm not going to get too deep into because that's somebody else's wheelhouse and a little less mine. But if you would say, well, fantasy is nothing more than escapism, then any of the power metal that we're talking about that is influenced by fantasy would also be called nothing more than escapism. It's a really unfair thing to say, and it's an unfair sweeping generalization to make. Instead, I think it would be more fair to look at how well fantasy lends to more storytelling. And no, not every work of fiction, not every genre of fiction lends well to more storytelling, but fantasy does. And there are plenty of different versions of it, as I talked about just a minute ago. There are people whose entire albums were inspired by anime. There are people whose albums are inspired by video games. Then there are people who have entire songs and albums that are inspired by their own mythology from the country that they come from, which I'm going to get into that in a minute. To say it's nothing more than escapism would be saying that the music is nothing more than escapism, and that is a very unfair generalization to make. The same as it would be unfair to say, well, that's because power metal is just for nerds. Now, I will jokingly say, oh, yeah, power metal is nerd shit because I am a nerd. And so, I proudly am like, oh, yeah, totally. We're nerds. Yeah, this is a thing. That wouldn't be fair of me either. To be labeled a nerd for just listening to power metal is again a sweeping generalization. Not a good thing. Personally, my response to that is an extremely biased response. I'm a giant nerd anyway. I play video games. I play D&D. I have an entire sleeve in process on my left arm that I call my nerd sleeve. And it has already got Tolkien, Narnia, and Star Wars on it, and there's more to come. So, my answer is an unfair answer. The whole lump summing idea and making sweeping statements just isn't okay. I have a very dear friend of mine. I call him my metal brother, and he is not a nerd at all, not in the least bit. And he loves his power metal. He loves the music. He loves the vocals. He loves the instrumentation of it. His appreciation of power metal is so much more in depth than the surface of the music itself because my friend is a very great musician. He's an amazing guitar player. He actually plays in a thrash metal band. He loves power metal. Sure, yeah, he understands the lyrics. He knows the lyrics. And sometimes he even laughs, is like, that's so dorky, but he still likes it. And there's a lot of people into power metal that are like that, where their level of appreciation is way beyond the fact that, yeah, these guys are telling a fantasy story. They're just appreciating the music itself. Maybe they're like, okay, but I just like it. Or maybe they are way more in depth on the talent that goes into it. And those are all valid answers and valid reasons for liking it. But you can't lump sum those people into the thing of saying, well, you're listening to some nerdy music, man. Okay, so what if they are? Big friggin' deal. So if you lump me into it, I'm not going to care. Somebody else, it's unfair to say. And so while some people make that connection and go, well, power metal's just nerdy shit. In general, yeah, it's pretty dorky. It's still not a fair assessment to make. But then that asks the question of like, okay, why did the artist go so hard on the fantasy and mythology side? How the hell am I supposed to know that answer? I know that's like that is such a cop out, but it is a true answer. The actual answer is you would have to go look at each individual artist and find out why. You would have to find out why Blind Guardian really likes Tolkien, why Windrose likes dwarves, why Dio clearly was into bad 80s fantasy movies that Mystery Science Theater frequently ripped on. Why did somebody do an entire album based off an anime? Why did somebody do an album based off The Wheel of Time? That is such an individual answer that there's no way I can answer that part. And then with some artists, they're going hard on the mythology side of things. That can be a little more cultural. And when I'm talking cultural in this case, I'm not talking about the fact of it's nerd culture. I mean, it's cultural on the country that they come from. There are a lot of countries that see their mythology, their stories, as a major part of their heritage and still a part of their culture. You do have a lot of bands that bring those pieces into it just because of the fact that it is a part of their culture and their own heritage, and they want to share that. That decision, that way of doing things moves far beyond power metal. You see artists doing that across the board. I think it's really cool. Then you also have other artists who look at mythology and think, well, that works, especially when you're looking at the mythology of Vikings. Because there is a romanticism and a mythical aspect and a fantasy aspect to Vikings that is not the actual historical reality. And a lot of metal bands dig in on that, which we are okay with. It's cool, but it's not real either. Of course, because of that, you've got Norse mythology and Norse paganism, which does lend very well to power metal as well, that a lot of people take on and pull inspiration from that too. Though I would argue that in a sense that can be a very cultural thing. I don't know enough about how cultural that is to talk too much on it. And so I'm not going to. But mythology in general does lend very well to power metal and symphonic metal as well. And I know I didn't spend much time on mythology. I've spent a lot more time on fantasy. I know that isn't the most fair to mythology. Then going back into the whole thing of the connections. Okay, but why though? The simplest answer is not the best answer, but the simplest answer is it works. And if it's not broke, don't fix it. Yeah, don't worry. I'm not ending the episode on that. If you're like me, I'm one of those people that I want you to tell me what time it is, but I also want you to tell me how the clock works. And if you don't do that, I am a little aggravated by it. Now, you may also be one of the people that saying, all right, this is what time it is totally okay with you. Some of you, though, were probably very aggravated with me by just giving that as an answer. Power metal and the people who pioneered the power metal sound just seem to like the fantasy thing. Does it work because the style lends well? Does it work because the pioneers made it work beforehand? But again, then we have to think of the sweeping generalizations because there are bands that very loosely incorporate mythology or fantasy. And that doesn't make them any less of a power metal band. They just kind of talk about other stuff. In general, though, fantasy does lend extremely well to power metal. Why? Okay, so there are a ton of responses of the ultimate why that I don't think are very valid responses. But I do believe the answer can be more than one answer. I think there are several valid responses as to why, and each of them have their own merit. I went through some of the answers and each of the little things that I talked about. The genre tends to be defined by having fantasy and mythology elements. That is a valid why of the answer. The fact that power metal tends to pull a lot from nerd culture, which then again, that kind of creates a weird cycle, though, doesn't it? Because it's like, yeah, but nerds pull from fantasy, and then we're back full circle again. However, still a valid answer. Could it be just a very simple fact that because power metal is defined as having influences from fantasy and mythology, musicians and artists who enjoy fantasy and mythology know that they have a space here? Another valid answer. But then you have people who have just really been into power metal for a really long time. They've gotten to know the genre, they've gotten to know the music. Obviously, they've gotten to know some of the influences. They themselves are a fairly talented artist in one way or another. And they're like, well, I want to go over here and make my own thing, but I'm going to pull influences from all this amazing stuff. Valid answer again. The fact that it's just a comfort spot for a lot of people is also a valid answer. There are bands that I can think of, and I want to see what you can think of that don't seem to have much fantasy or mythology influence, but they are very firmly in the power metal genre. And so it's like, well, what are they doing here? Well, they're still fucking power metal. They just don't have fantasy or mythology influences. Fantasy in general lends very well to this genre. And it lends very well to this genre for several reasons. But it doesn't have to either. That is the main takeaway from here. As I would say in my regular workday, this is our key takeaways, guys. We're going to do some actionable points now. No, I'm not going to do that. Oh, I feel gross by even saying that. I'm so sorry. Of course, then again, I could go back into episode 1 and talking about how some people took certain things that were a little darker and seen as a little darker and pulled them into their music to basically just be like, well, you can go get a giant middle finger. That was from episode 1, but it did happen, and it's valid that it happened, though it did pull some more fantasy influence into things. Because at that time, you had a lot of people who saw certain works of fantasy also as part of the satanic panic. And so some bands that were getting targeted did just go, well, I'm going to pull this in here then. You also saw pieces of mythology as part of the satanic panic in the United States, which is really unfortunate because some of that was very cultural. I'm sure a lot of people who found that to be deeply cultural also found that to be very insulting. And I don't blame them if they did. There were also a lot of bands who saw that and said, well, we're just going to latch on to this too. Give me this, give me this, give me this. So there was a little bit of that kind of bringing fantasy into it, though it still was a reason and part of the reason, excuse me, for the connection. But when it all boils down to it, the answer is still it works. And if it's not broke, don't fix it. That would be extremely oversimplifying the answer, but it's still a valid answer. When it truly, truly comes to telling you why, I don't have that answer, and I'm not sure who does. Again, there are several valid answers and reasons, and there are a lot of connections going out there that when you put all the dots together, the dots spell power metal. Fantasy and mythology is not going anywhere when it comes to power metal and in a lot of cases symphonic metal too. I know somebody's going to say something eventually. So I'm going to say this right now. I am very aware that some bands that I named off are symphonic metal bands and not power metal bands. I know that answer. I also know some of the bands that I named off cross between the two. Back to what I was saying. It's always going to lend well. It's always going to kind of be there. It's always going to be part of it. There are connections to it. However, you make that connection, whether you totally refuse to make that connection or not, that's totally okay. The answers as to why are going to be a lot more complex than I think any one person can answer without literally doing, I don't know, a PhD level study on it or something. And since we spent some time today talking about the people who pioneered the sound and were part of the deep roots of power metal, next episode, we're going to talk more about those bands, more about the roots of power metal, and a little more about the evolution of power metal. Don't worry, I'm not just going to talk about Dio. However, I do have an episode planned in the future where we are going to look at Dio a little more in depth because I think Dio does deserve his own episode when it comes to talking about power metal. We are also going to talk in the future a little more about gatekeeping in metal, which is a teeny tiny little subject that I talked on today. And I think my take on that is going to end up to be a little controversial for some people. We are going to go a little more in depth on Tolkien's influence on power metal because I think that's important to talk about. And yes, my wonderful, beautiful symphonic metal people, we are going to dedicate an entire episode to the roots of and evolution of symphonic metal. For now, though, I'm out of here for this episode. I know this was a shorter episode. That's totally okay. They don't all have to be an hour long or close to an hour long. Guys, if you want to check it out, there is now an official website. It is themetalmama.com. You can also find a Discord server to join and come hang out with people and share some music and chitty chat. You will always be able to find show notes and links on the show notes on the website. And if you would like to look at more in depth topics on the episode, you can go check out the blog where I pick a couple of topics from each episode and do some pretty in depth deep dive articles. And that would be on the website as well. My name is Candace. Most people call me the Metal Mama, and I will see you guys in a couple of weeks. Some keyboards and string instruments. Let me do that. Phone, why you go off? Why didn't I turn off my phone? That was not smart of me. And there's a car outside. Let's let the car go. Oh no, it's a school bus. The simplest answer would be a very unfair. Thank you, Zero.
Hi, puppy. What do you need?
You just went out like an hour ago, dude. You don't have to go out again. Oh, geez. Yeah, I gotta trim your claws.
Oh my goodness, hi.
You just knocked my mic.